Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, you're all welcome to the 2019 Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development. A warm welcome to this cold but sunny spring morning in Stockholm. My name is Annika Ben David. I am Ambassador at Large for Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and it is my privilege to be your guide during the first part of this forum. So please welcome in and be seated. We have an important day ahead of us with very prominent international guests. We look forward to a challenging and inspiring exchange. We will begin, as you know, with a plenary session. After that, you will have the choice of no less than 10 parallel sessions. In the afternoon, we will gather again for a final plenary session. I think I can promise a very interesting day, and you're most welcome to engage with us and comment on social media. You will find the hashtag and all other relevant information in the program or in the forum app that I hope that you have downloaded. Let us jointly spread the message, inclusive peace is the way forward. Before we start, let us all make sure that we have put our mobile phones on silent mode. Now, let me begin by welcoming Yann Eliasson, Chair of SIPRI, long-standing Swedish champion for multilateralism and peace, at the helm of the United Nations and the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Please.
Thank you very much. I have to explain my somewhat stumbling arrival. Don't, at older age, get a Labrador at 11 months old, and above all, don't let your leash be around the hand because you fall very violently. So now you know why I'm here. It's a temporary condition, I hope. Ministers, and they are from several countries here: Mali, Lebanon, Iraq, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia. Excellencies, UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner, of course, President of the ICRC, Achim Steiner, and all of you, friends and champions of peace building, welcome. Welcome to Stockholm and Sweden at the best time of the year. I will not suggest that you come in the coldest of winter unless you're invited to the Nobel Prize ceremony. But it's wonderful to see you, and I'm very happy to welcome you as co-chair, as chair of the SIPRI governing board, to this 6th Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development. And I'm very happy to have here in the room the co-chair, represented by Minister Peter Eriksson, whom you will hear very soon. We have had this project for 5-6 years. And without being too presumptuous, I can tell you it's been a remarkable success. It's been growing almost exponentially by the year. And I sometimes ask myself, why has this forum been received so extremely well? I think it's because there is a need for a marketplace for ideas in a broad spectrum, and there is also a need for meeting people from different walks that are of importance for your own work, whether it is out in the field or at headquarters in our different organizations. It is absolutely crucial that we see the value of being inclusive, as Annika said in her introduction, in our work. I was president of General Assembly in the UN 2005 and 2006, and I'm extremely proud of a formula that we established at that time. It simply says that there is no peace without development. But there is no development without peace. And there is no peace nor development without respect of human rights and rule of law and working out well-functioning institutions. These three factors are interdependent and mutually strengthening. And we need to come out of the vertical, the silo method of working, whether it is at headquarters or out in the field. We need to work horizontally And by the way, by that I don't mean go to sleep. We need to bring in the different functions, whether they relate to work on peace and security, or to development, or to institution building, or human rights and rule of law. But we also need to bring in the actors from the different areas. Of course, international organizations well represented here, governments well represented, Parliament, SIPRI, by the way, is a product of Parliament's decision, celebrating peace in Sweden, and the civil society, which is well represented in this room, and of course the private sector, and more, I would hope, academia. So here we have a need to mobilize around the problem and do it in a horizontal way, inclusive way. This is going to make our work, if we go that direction now, it's going to be one of the most important reform changes that we need in running institutions. And we need to do that well in today's world with mistrust in institutions. That in combination with preventive action, I think, are the two best recipes to change the course in today's world. I also believe that we have a couple of new, I would say, tools that we didn't have before 2015, in the case that I will refer to. I'm thinking in particular of the Sustainable Development Goals. I once, just a couple of months ago, talked to Johan Rockström, who is a very well-known expert on climate, as you know. And he was very grateful for the work we did. And I see several of you who were on the floor in the UN getting this wonderful agreement on the 17 goals adopted. And he said, you did a fantastic work. We should have a name for it, as one name that summarizes 17 goals. And I said the usual in the UNE's language, well, it's a roadmap for a sustainable world. Now he says you have to do it more practical. Well, how about a repair box, a repair tool, a repair box to repair the world? Better. But then he said, let's call it a survival kit for humanity. These goals are a survival kit for humanity. And they are also, by the way, the implementation method of the Paris Agreement. The second concept that I would like to mention, which is very relevant in this room, with all of you who represent so many of these different areas and doing such a great work, both at headquarters and in the field, is the concept sustaining peace. It means that we adopt that a peace effort has to be containing both the preventive part, the operational part of the crisis, and the post-conflict situations, and that we need to mobilize all these resources. So in fact, this conference is a wonderful expression of both the need for living up to the SDGs, and by that the Paris Agreement, but also to the sustaining peace concept. And finally learn that we have to be very good in our silos, vertically, but my God, we need to work together with others in order to reach result. So with these words, I will just want to welcome you to this conference. I hope that you will enjoy it, both professionally and personally, that you will network, that you will exchange business cards, and that you will stay in touch, and realize that by knitting these ties to each other, you will improve the chances to find solutions. Because it is only when we learn to live up to the most important word in the world today that we can get things done. And that word, not surprisingly, is the word together. So thank you very much for coming together today, and have a good conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yann, for this energizing message that will resonate with us throughout this forum. I now have the honor to invite to the stage the Minister for International Development Cooperation of Sweden, Mr. Peter Eriksson.
Well, thank you so much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, and let me join Yann Eliasson's welcoming you all. As Minister for International Development, I feel privileged to host a forum with such a broad and deep knowledge on peace and development, and to work for breaking these silos. Saving lives today and building peace for tomorrow, is that possible? This is the basic question of the Stockholm Forum this year. Are we connecting efforts for immediate stability with more long-term peace building and development cooperation? The answer is unfortunately not a clear yes. Our joint efforts do not always add up. Humanitarian assistance, security responses, development cooperation, and peace building are different communities and use different terminology and approaches. However, many times they are working in the same settings where we need to seize opportunities for synergies while respecting different mandates. This year's Stockholm Forum is designed to challenge conventional wisdoms. Our task is to deliver ideas of how to work better together. The challenges many of you here today face in your work, in both meeting immediate humanitarian needs and saving lives and building more long-term sustainable peace and prosperity must be solved. That is why I'm also particularly happy to acknowledge representatives from a number of countries where this approach is a real-life necessity. Minister colleagues from Iraq, Lebanon, and Somalia are especially welcome here today, and Ethiopia, I think, also. The Sustainable Development Goal number 16, what you mentioned, on peaceful societies is at the core of Agenda 2030. The implementation is particularly challenging for countries in conflict and fragility, but it must be done. This is where poverty is taking root today. This is where the flaws of our international community are the most visible and perhaps the most painful. This is where the work must start. Saying this, it's important to have in mind that all SDGs are integrated and interdependent. For example, extreme weather conditions with droughts and floods influence food security and sometimes resulting in forced migration. We know that climate change is a risk factor in fragile situations. The recent cyclones in southern Africa, for example, show the urgent need to strengthen resilience. The drought in the Chad Lake and Sahel region is also a clear signal that climate change is a security question. When affected by conflict and extreme weather, inequalities within and between countries can also arise and become more severe. It's well known that more equal societies are more resilient toward risk factors and less likely to enter into violent conflict. Many marginalized communities face extreme hardship with low institutional capacity to meet the stresses caused by both climate-related risks and conflict dynamics. A joint focus on implementing the SDGs and by that addressing crisis, building peace, resilience and long-term development is essential. The UN is currently implementing reforms for improved delivery on this crisis response, sustaining peace and sustainable development. The World Bank has also initiated development of a new strategy for fragility, conflict and violence. The OECD DAC has developed new recommendations on the humanitarian development, peace and nexus. The EU is implementing its integrated approach to conflict and crisis. The African Union is stepping up its engagement beyond crisis response. The G7 plus network of fragile states continues to promote peer exchange and learning among conflict-affected countries. These are all important initiatives. However, we need to ask ourselves if they will make sufficient difference on the ground, especially when we see that conflicts and crises tend to go on for decades and sometimes never seems to end. My view is that inclusive peace leads to sustainable peace. Both women's and men's as well as young people, participation and leadership is crucial in promoting a culture of peace. and preventing exclusion and violence. Promoting democratic reforms and human rights is, of course, a central issue. Let me therefore end by posing 3 questions to you. One is, how can existing support change to become more specific and directed towards really building inclusive peace? Number 2, are there sufficient mechanisms in place for bringing actors in crisis response together with peace building and development actors? If not, what is needed? 3, since many decades, we have the Geneva Conventions designing the rules of war. Do we need to develop and adopt common principles for building peace? I hope that the Forum will contribute with concrete proposals in these questions, and I look forward to taking part of the results of your forthcoming deliberations. Coming together is not the new way of working, it's the only way of working if we are supposed to take on the challenges of today and achieve Agenda 2030 for all. Saving lives today and building peace for tomorrow is possible if we do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for these inspiring words. Indeed, you captured the challenges and the opportunities of the topic of our forum, and we will take your key messages and questions into our deliberations. Thank you. It is now my great honor to introduce Dr. Sima Samar, a doctor for the poor, an educator of the marginalized and a defender of human rights for all in Afghanistan. Dr. Samar served in the interim administration of Afghanistan and established the first ever Ministry for Women's Affairs. And since 2004, she has chaired the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission that holds human rights violators accountable, a commitment that has put her life at great risk. Dr. Samar, I give you the floor of the forum, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, may I ask everyone to stand up and pay respect to the victims of human rights violation in conflict and terrorism for a minute. Thank you all. It's my pleasure and honor to be among such a distinguished people and discuss the sustainable peace, inclusive peace. And I understand more than maybe many other participants in this world that how war is destroying the life of the people and how destructive can be. Thirdly, I'm not academician and I'm not researcher. I'm just a practical person who lived through the 40 years of war and fought against almost all the regimes, from the extreme left regime of the USSR style of regime up to extreme right regime of Taliban. In the middle, the people's human rights, including myself, has been violated. And everybody goes without accountability and justice. I think why the conflict started, and my personal belief and my personal experience, when the people's human rights are violated, when the people's freedom are restricted, when there's a discrimination against people, when there's no equality in the people, and there's no access to justice for the people, then conflicts start, because there's poverty, there's lack of justice, there's lack of equal distribution of resources in the country. And this is something that's very, very important, and it's the reality in Afghanistan. And I think all of our countries, like Afghanistan, when the people are not happy and there are a group of other people either in our neighboring countries or in the region who would like to use that particular group in order to promote violence, in order to promote war in the country. The reason that we always claim that my neighbor is interfering, I mean, I was doing Sudan when I met His Excellency Yann Elias in Sudan when he was a special envoy, and I was working as a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Sudan. And I think Sudanese were also in Darfur saying Chad or neighboring. And I said, that what if we didn't have Pakistan beside us and you didn't have Chad beside you? But we are not looking at our own country's problem, that what is the actual problem in the ground that the people are being used by our neighboring countries. And I think it's all over. No, you don't find any countries who doesn't have conflict with their neighbors. And unfortunately, we do not have the choice to choose our neighbor. That is another reality of our life. So that is when there's a violation of human rights, when there's a restriction on freedom of expression, and the people doesn't have access to justice and so on, then the people start to resist against those things. And then conflicts start. Afghanistan is in conflict, and this is 41 years. It's 41 years of conflict continued. We have generation who born in this conflict and who grown up in this conflict. And I think of course, war and conflict destroyed everything in the country. The social structure, the economy, the infrastructure. First of all, we were not a very developed country, but whatever we had was destroyed during the war. And who are the most vulnerable group of the society? So when I say women as a half of the population in the society, or gun walking around and ruling the society. One of the things that I would say that we in Afghanistan, we witnessed the destruction of our houses, the destruction of our whatever we had, the agriculture that we had, a piece of land. We saw the disappearances and killing of our loved ones, our sons, our brothers, our husbands, our fathers. But we're still there. And then the majority of those people who were displaced and who were pushed to another country to be refugee was also women. And what's happened when there's a conflict? Because of a lack of security, because of misuse of women as a tool of war, even the closest member of your family trying to protect you. That protection is to stay behind the wall. In our case, we had more than 6 million refugees in Pakistan and Iran and other countries. I mean, I don't see any country in the world that we have no Afghans in it. So that is not by choice. That is not because they went for holidays. They went for fun. They were pushed to go to those countries. And for the refugees, what's happened, for example, we had millions of refugees in our neighboring countries. First of all, their basic rights to education was not a question, actually, was not paid attention. And you all know that education is really key for changing the society, building a society, promoting democracy, promoting human rights. If there's no education, then we cannot really do much. We cannot live at the daily standards or live up on the standards that's existing today. The second point which was really crucial for the Afghan refugees, the limited access to health services, to quality health services, let's say, and particularly for women, access to reproductive rights and contraception. Then what's happened? They brought children more and more and more, and then they become more poor. And because of poverty, they had to give their male children to the madrasas, to the religious school, and they become Taliban today. So it was not mushrooming. It was a reality in an environment ready for that kind of a thing. So unfortunately, the religious education for the Afghan children used for continuation of proxy war in Afghanistan. And then what's happened to the girls? Because there were no schools for the girls. They become poorer, and they were more vulnerable to sexual abuses, to trafficking, to child marriage, to forced marriages. They are sold because to feed the rest of the family. And a lot of sexual violence and rapes happen, not only to the young girls, but also unfortunately, to the young boys. So these are what's happened in the society and destroy the fabric of the Afghan society and culture. And of course, there's no access to justice. When you are living in a camp and you don't see. I mean, the camps was ruled by a different political party, and they did what they want. So they had their own rule and regulation. There were no proper access to justice. There were no access to shelter. If you do not have access to a shelter, how can you feel security? So the human security was lost. And the difficult part was there was not enough sanitation program for women. So what can you do? I mean, there's plans, even after the fall of the Taliban regime, you see that they spent millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in building the road, if I just say the road as an example. From Kabul to Kandahar, $800 million was spent. Nobody built 2 or 3 public baths that women can use while they're traveling for 6 or 7 hours. What is the reason? The reason is that women are not involved, and nobody understands there is need. Imagine that the person who wants to travel, the night before we stop to drink because we don't know where to go, and we don't feel secure. But for the men, it's quite easy. And also the situation in insecurity restrict the people's movement. And they push the people to the jobs and activities that they will not do in the normal circumstances. I'm saying this because why the people are involved on drug and production of opium and smuggling of opium. A small number of people really benefit from the business, but the majority of the people are doing it because there's no other job opportunity. So then I think, when we talk of peace, then we have to include women. Unfortunately, my focus is mainly on women, but I think inclusivity means half of the population should be part of the peace process. And we all know that the women's rights is a political agenda. I mean, in every election, in every country, almost, they say that we do this and this and this for women. And then when the election is over, then everything is gone until next election. So I think these are important issues. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was, now it's 70 years old, is based on equality, based on the non-discrimination, based on access to justice, based on life with dignity. So these are the things that we can really take it seriously in order to push for human rights, push for justice, push for sustainable peace. We cannot have sustainable peace if we undermine peace, if we undermine human rights. We cannot have peace if we undermine justice. Because if there's no freedom, then we don't have peace. Because I keep saying that in this case, if you don't have the freedom of expression, if freedom of movement, you don't have equal rights, you are discriminated, then the peaceful place would be graveyard. Nobody protests. So we do not want to be in the graveyard. So there are other tools to push and promote human rights. And we cannot say that human rights is only for men, and it should be, as we say, equality, it should be real equality in the societies. And the people, men, women, and others should live with dignity. So there's a lot of action has been taken, the Beijing Platform of Action in order to promote women's rights and equality. I mean, how much we are going to reach to that position, that's another question. But yes, there are improvements, but it's not enough. SDG number 5 is pushing for gender equality, and we should practice this equality from our home. If we do not stop the violence against women within the family, we cannot stop the violence within the community, within the society. And SDG number 16 requires justice, peace with justice. All these SDGs, which is, as rightly said, that a path to sustainable peace, I would say a path to justice, a path to life with dignity for everyone, everywhere, without their religion, looking at their religion and culture and geography boundaries. But it should be a real equality and real access to justice and under the rule of law. That's why I think that peace should be inclusive of everyone, men, women, people with disability, minorities, you name it, different gender, different people with different religion, different language, different geographic location. And the majority of the people should support that process. Otherwise, it will be a deal between some people, and we will not end up with a sustainable peace. The third point is that women should be really part of the planning for the peace, in the negotiation table, and also on the implementation part. Meaningful participation of women, not because we are wearing colorful clothes and make the scene more colorful and beautiful. It should be more than that. It should be qualified women who can raise their voice, who can raise the concern of women, who can really raise the issues that women are asking, not their personal issues. The fourth point, I think that the victims should be involved. I mean, you see that everywhere we talk about the issue of peace, but victims practically are forgotten by all of us. So we have to focus on victims and heal the wound of the victims. Otherwise, they will take revenge. We see it. Afghanistan is a good example. It's a living example that they take revenge. When they take revenge in killing people, then the whole violence continues. You cannot stop it if you do not find a mechanism to heal the wound and promote reconciliation, a real reconciliation. It's not a reconciliation between the two groups or 10 people who are signatory to the peace process. And I think that is really important, that women and the other groups, civil society, people with disabilities, they should be, from the beginning, involved to the peace process on the negotiation and also on the implementation. Personally, I saw that there might be a very good peace agreement, but if they don't implement, then the violence continues. I mean, we are agree on Sudan, for example. Sudan had a very good peace, comprehensive peace agreement. And then finally, I would say that we cannot really reach to the peace if there is no respect for human rights, and if there is no accountability and justice for the people. And I think my final word would be, let's stand united, because the people who are defending human rights and values of human rights, are much smaller than the one who are populistic and self-oriented leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samar, for your crucial observations and messages on the connections between peace building and the protection of human rights that will feed into our discussions today. Now, to conclude the introductory part of the forum, I have the privilege to introduce Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross and a person with more than 30 years of experience in international cooperation and on working in crises and conflict. We are looking forward to your keynote address on the very topic of the forum, crisis response and peace building, achieving synergies. Dr. Maurer, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Ministers, colleagues and friends, some of you may be asking why a representative of a humanitarian organization is offering introductory remarks to a conference in which the focus is on peace. I hope I can convince at least some of you that in an increasingly interconnected world, it is important to take a fresh look at the specificities, but also the linkages between some key societal aspirations like peace, security, development, and human rights on the one side, and humanitarian crisis response on the other. And I will first and foremost focus on this tension. The dilemma we are facing today is how to expand and uphold neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action while designing and understanding such action as a bridge to broader and more ambitious transformative agendas. No matter on how we characterize this dilemma, above all, we must anchor our discussions in the reality of people living under the shadow of conflict, insecurity, and fragility. This is particularly important given that more than 80% of the people displaced by violence and conflict today originate from fewer than 20 particularly vulnerable contexts, most of them privileged areas of humanitarian action, and that those contexts endanger the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals in particular. Working on the front lines, the ICRC bears witness to suffering in conflicts those suffering in conflicts around the world. And we also observe how new dynamics of violence are taking a heavy toll on the lives of every man, women, and children. In recent years, we have seen how the gap is widening between the scale of humanitarian needs and the available humanitarian responses. Despite all the effort to grow the humanitarian sector and to respond through emergency operations to such contexts, we also recognize that gaps do not disappear and will not be closed by traditional humanitarian action only. The dominant features of fragility that we see today include high levels of violence, whether through military or counterterrorism operations, inter-community violence or criminality, underdevelopment and lack of reliable essential services, failures of governance and endemic corruption, the impacts of climate change exacerbating existing pressures and embedding new fragilities and enormous humanitarian needs, whether through displacements, pandemics, or loss of educations and livelihoods. These factors are exacerbated by protracted urbanized conflicts which not only kill and maim, but destroy systems, infrastructures, and economies, and thus compel humanitarian actors to take a new look at what people need in such fragile environments. I'm reminded of the shells of destroyed cities we have seen in recent years: Mosul, Aleppo, Taiz, and many more. The deep structural degradation of infrastructure and social systems in cities will be incredibly difficult to repair and will require high levels of investments over long term. But it is exactly in these places where we see a patent absence of development actors because of security risk or political blockages to envisage broader developmental agendas. In protracted, decade-old conflict, people's needs go beyond emergency assistance. Even though battles are being fought, chronic diseases still need to be treated. Children still need education. Adults still need jobs, even in the middle of war and violence. People's needs are many-sided. They are short, medium, and long-term. They are individual and community-oriented. They are material, but also psychological and psychosocial. The realities on the ground are moving further away by the day from the classical bureaucracies, structures, processes, and policy categories which the international community has created to deal with such issues of concern. Human rights, peace building, development, humanitarian action, realities just don't fit the boxes. At the same time, with these deep needs, it is clear that no actor working alone will be able to meet the demands. Today's needs landscape has long surpassed any individual approach of an organization. And there are no blanket solutions. Instead, we must adapt to the particular needs of communities, to their skills and resilience capacities. Approaches will differ enormously, for example, in low or middle-income countries, but both categories are part of our concerns. Approaches must be strongly localized as well as supported by neutral international actors. Complementarity of efforts centered on creating maximum impact for people will therefore be essential. Dear colleagues, humanitarian actors are not peace builders. Neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian action is distinct from political agendas, and it must remain so. Yet, I would argue that while others make peace, humanitarian action helps to make peace possible. International humanitarian law has positive and multiplying impacts when it is respected. For example, when the principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution are applied. Lives are saved. Hospitals and schools remain open. Markets can function, and a reconciliation after the conflict becomes easier. Frontline humanitarian action, too, is a vital stabilizing factor in fragmented environments and a building block towards greater stabilization. Principled humanitarian action serves to protect against development reversals caused by the effects of war and the divisions in societies. For example, in recent years in Syria, as the war has shifted into new phases, ICRC has adopted a two-track approach, providing emergency food shelter to displaced population, but also working in areas with greater stability to repair water, sanitation, and electrical infrastructure. We have also shifted to replace in-kind by cash assistance and thus prepare the ground for a return of regular economic life to support market creations and income-generating activities. And it is not only in Syria, but in many other contexts, millions of people survive and can go back to previously stable lives because of sustained humanitarian upkeeping of infrastructure, health systems, or investments in community building and livelihood support. Also today, the ICRC is fulfilling varying requests to act as a neutral intermediary in conflict. Each and every month, when my colleagues brief me on the engagement we entertain to establish linkages between belligerents, I wonder whether out of isolated humanitarian activities, we are able to build a more sustained engagement pointing beyond humanitarian action. We are called on to prevent relations from deteriorating or to find mutual trust-building measures that would help increase stability. Here in Stockholm, the Yemeni parties agreed to make detention exchanges an important next step in peace negotiations, and it is ICRC's humanitarian expertise which has supported the negotiation of a draft agreement which hopefully one day will not only lead to implementation of the agreement, but also to something broader than humanitarian results. Our mode of working is distinct, drawing on our humanitarian experience and relying on the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But the effect of our action hopefully allows for more than just neutral and impartial action. Throughout humanitarian disarmament initiatives, we are engaging bilaterally and multilaterally to build consensus to limit the use of indiscriminate harmful weapons. Over the years, we have seen strong support from the international community on weapons treaties, including to ban chemical and biological weapons or landmines. Now, with conventional arms reaching record levels in conflict areas, we are also urging states to influence, to lead by example, and to ensure no weapon is supplied where there is a clear risk it would be used to commit or facilitate serious violation of international humanitarian law. We are also working with others to create greater impact. New financing models, such as the Humanitarian Impact Bond, the Famine Action Mechanism with the World Bank and the United Nations, are testing grounds to align complementary experience, data, and finance, and to bring states, the private sector, and humanitarian actors together in finding new and more meaningful tools to address some of the big disruptions of our time. Dear colleagues, with humanitarian demands vast and complex, we must find a basis on which to work differently. It will take all of us working together and throughout our distinct roles to prevent and alleviate suffering, to build stability, and to take the first steps on a long path back to peace and development. I'm aware that some are afraid that principled humanitarian action risks losing its soul by trying to build pathways to peace and development. But may I remind them what the founding fathers of the ICRC in their foundational assembly of 1863 have agreed upon, that humanitarian action could only escape the danger of prolonging war if it were shaped in a way that it would contribute to the creation of peace in the long run. As a four-time recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, the ICRC hopes that Sweden and Norway and many others may have a clearer understanding than anybody else about the intrinsic link of principled humanitarianism with broader societal aspiration. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Maurer, for your tremendously captivating and insightful presentation. The challenges force us to work together, and you and the ICRC are indeed taking the responsibility in developing new and innovative ways of doing so. Thanks again. We look forward to continuing this discussion throughout the forum. This concludes the introduction of the forum and brings us to the first interactive segment of this plenary. I'd now like to invite the panelists to take the seat for the first discussion on the topic Crisis Response and Peace Building, How to Create Synergies. Please join me here on the stage. What we are going to discuss is if military and civil crisis interventions bring sustainable peace and how it can collaborate with humanitarian development and peace-building actors. What are the risks and the opportunities for such an endeavor? And I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. Hello.
Good morning. How are you? Good to see you. Hello. How are you? Hi, Raya from Lebanon. Hello. Hi. How are you?
Please, those of you who are standing in the margins, there are seats available to this side of the hall, so please join us.
Okay, I think we have to speak then. Yeah.
Please. All right. Bonjour.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Bonjour, madame. General. Okay.
Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning.
Great to sit next to my sister.
All right, as you can see, we have a very distinguished and experienced panel. Let's see how I can sit so I don't turn my back to anyone here. I'm delighted to introduce you to Raya Haffar al-Hassan, Minister of Interior and Municipalities in Lebanon. Enchantée, Madame la Ministre. Soyez la bienvenue à Stockholm. Achim Steiner, Administrator of the UNDP. Dr. Hafiz Khanem, Vice President for Africa at the World Bank. Hirut Zemene, State Secretary for Political Affairs at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia. General Dennis Yülenspore, Force Commander of the MINUSMA peacekeeping operation in Mali. And Karin Wallensten, State Secretary for International Affairs at the Prime Minister's Office in Stockholm. A warm welcome to all of you. You are all most welcome to this discussion, and I'm looking forward to an interesting exchange of views, perspectives, and knowledge from your respective spheres of operation. Again, this session is aimed at confronting the dilemmas of connecting the compromises and negotiations that are necessary for immediate stability with the planning and vision necessary for peace-building agendas such as the Agenda 2030 and the UN sustaining peace resolutions. I would like to start our discussion with a question to Achim Steiner, Administrator of the UNDP. The UN reform agenda has changed the United Nations system to enable a more decentralized and effective support to peace, development, and human rights. How can this new approach bring actors together, different actors together? What is needed for this to happen, please?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I am still thinking a little bit about the keynote address that Peter Maurer just gave, and I think in his narrative from a humanitarian perspective lies the connection also to what you refer to as the UN reform agenda. And I would rather cast it not so much in reform agenda terms, but rather in what Antonio Guterres, upon assuming the role of Secretary General, articulated a very clear vision that he wanted the UN as a whole to be more engaged and more focused on what it was actually originally set up to do, which is to prevent war, to prevent the failures of society, of governments that result in conflict. And so being at a forum on peace and development is precisely where he sought to put the emphasis in reconnecting what we might call the instruments. And the danger is, as Peter also pointed out, in each of the communities, I mean, the fact that we talk about a humanitarian, about a development, about a peace community and mandates already shows how something that should be naturally connected has in part become disconnected because of the way that we operate in our ministries, in our institutions, in our professional communities. And yet, prevention, if you take it at its core, is to understand what are the greatest risks to social cohesion, to nations staying together, to differences not becoming a source of conflict, but simply a reality of society. And in the UN reform context, just to go back to your question, a key framework within which we are trying to recast our work is the 2030 Agenda. It is the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to turn them on their head for 1 minute, and that is to say, we often talk about goals in the sense of the future, the aspiration, the things that lie ahead that we aspire to. But actually, if you take a security narrative, which runs right through the discussion on peace and development, then you can also look at the Sustainable Development Goals as a risk map or a risk matrix. Because what it says to you is, if you want to be effective in preventing war, conflict, crisis, then here are 17 lenses through which you can actually look at the risks to society. In each one of them lie the seeds of implosion. In each one of them lie the seeds of crisis and a nation, societies falling apart. So when we, for example, the World Bank and the United Nations produced the Pathways to Peace report, and I urge you, for those of you who are interested in the narrative of trying to overcome these divisions in instruments and approaches, I felt we captured a great deal of that which we have to do differently. And that goes to the core of trying to understand that if you have failed to address those risks, if you have to become a peacekeeping operation, if you have to deploy humanitarian aid, then essentially it is, in part at least, a development failure. So there is something that needs to be linked to the SDGs that is not just about the future, it's about managing risks today. And Seema is sitting here. You spoke of examples that are very much central to a radar that we should apply to looking at those risks. Final point, if you are in a crisis situation, if you are, like Dennis, leading a force like MINUSMA, you essentially also realize that the military and security response, at best, can calm things down, can stabilize things, can create conditions within which you can begin to rebuild. And here again, the SDGs become a vital roadmap because they are the areas in which we can re-establish pathways to development. And I think this is why when you then ask me about UN reform, I want us to quickly move away from the mechanics of reform. Reform is a means to an end. The end is to make us more capable of preventing war, conflict, development failures, and secondly, to deliver more coherently, cohesively, in the spirit that Peter Maurer also outlined just now, early, rapid responses to when we have to help societies get out of protracted conflict and crisis. And that is what we're trying to do together in many countries today. The World Bank, the UN family in Yemen right now, the stabilization program that was put in place in Iraq, I think is perhaps one of the most remarkable features of changing the way we do business in the sense of rapidly, massively scaling up the reconstruction effort in the context of humanitarian support in order to allow people to return to where they would want to rebuild their homes. I'll stop here, but there are a couple of illustrations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those illustrations. Of course, we know that it's still early days, but it's good to hear that you already have detected concrete results, positive results of the UN reform. Let me then continue with Raya Haffar al-Hassan, Minister of Interior and Municipalities from Lebanon. Obviously, in Lebanon, there are a multitude of security, development, and humanitarian actors, given the geopolitical realities of today. As Minister, what opportunities do you see for cooperation between various actors to increase the effectiveness of international support? And what are the risks involved in your perspective? And how can we strengthen the national ownership and people-centered approaches based on a Lebanese experience?
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be sitting on this session with such esteemed panelists. As you rightly said, we've been, Lebanon for the last 30, 40 years, have been through all sorts of crises. You name it, we have it. So from an economic crisis to a fiscal crisis, to civil wars, to proxy wars waged on our land, to derivatives of wars, regional wars spilling over to our country. And subsequent to that, we've had all sorts of support also. Technical assistance support, concessional loan support, humanitarian support, guarantees. Also, we had the opportunity to benefit from a whole gamut of support from different international donor agencies. I've personally lived through the civil war, managed the repercussions of a war, and coordinate technical assistance in the context of wars. So I can safely say, frankly, that we can be a model for what works and what doesn't. Okay. And maybe this is something that the international donor community can be inspired from as an example of how better they can optimize the effectiveness of aid post-conflict. Of course, the onus always is on us as countries. We are, unfortunately, in a region that is prone to bouts of violence and conflict. And this is something that we have to live with. However, I believe that we can address, through donor assistance, some of the drivers of conflict. How to do that? I think, if you allow me just to focus now on the donor community side and leave the rest of what we need to do, which is the bigger responsibility, to another, maybe to another session. What happens post-conflict is that donors come with certain hurdles, recipients of these assistance come with certain hurdles. And post-conflict, all of these sets of hurdles come together, they're intertwined in a very urgent, emergency-like situation, and which leads to a recipe of inefficiencies. Usually the donors come, we have to admit, sometimes with their own political agenda. Okay? Not only that, many donors come with different political agendas. To top it all, some donors in their own countries, their political administration comes with an agenda that is different than from the development agency in that particular country. Second, these donors usually come in droves, which we are very grateful for. But from what we've seen, they don't necessarily work together. And probably the problem lies with us because we don't provide them with a framework through which they can converge their assistance towards fulfilling certain objectives for a local or a development agenda that we have set for ourselves. Third, donors usually mistrust us, which we understand. Okay? But frankly, this undermines and dilutes assistance and leads to unsustainable development. Because if you don't localize aid and you don't empower us, how are we going to really use that aid, use that assistance to build sustainable peace? We have to have local ownership. And I agree the onus is on us, but I think the donor community can also help in this regards. From our end, as recipient countries, we come with also our political, the political underpinnings of the conflict that started is there, and the donors, poor donors, have to navigate through the web of these political intricacies, which makes it very hard for them. Second, we are bureaucratic, and we are plagued with all sorts of bureaucratic procedures that makes the donors also shy away from us and sidestep us. Third, a lot of our countries are cursed with the perception of being corrupt, which also means that localizing aid is not forthcoming. So imagine bringing all of these hurdles together. And that is not definitely a recipe for building ownership of development aid and making sure that this leads to sustainable peace. And this is where the crux of the matter is. I think we have a lot of lessons that we can share with the donor community on how to do that, from the beneficiary side and from the donor side. I think we need to use peace times to prepare ourselves for when a conflict happens, especially in our parts of the world where, unfortunately, we are conflict-prone more than in other regions. So what can we do as donors and recipient countries in peacetime in order to build the institutional capacities of local governments in order to sustain development aid and make sure that they trickle down to the end beneficiaries and that they trickle down to addressing the drivers of conflicts that basically fueled the conflict in the first place. So that's my 2 cents worth of intervention.
Thank you, Madam Minister. It's easy to imagine from the trajectory, the national trajectory of Lebanon, that you've had ample of opportunities, sadly, to navigate challenges like this. And I retain from what you said that Lebanon wishes to be a model for what works and what not. So it's very good that you are with us today. And the formula that you seem to suggest is to for Lebanon to create a framework that inspires the trust of donors, and so that Lebanon can be empowered to deliver on the assistance and cooperation of others. Thank you very much for now. I now turn to the World Bank. The World Bank is increasingly investing in crisis and conflict-affected situations. So therefore, I would like to ask you, Dr. Hafez Khanem, Vice President for Africa at the World Bank, by 2030, more of half of the world's population will be living in fragile and conflict-affected countries. What is the World Bank doing in addressing development needs in humanitarian contexts? And how can an institution such as the World Bank contribute to peace building, which is somewhat of a novel role for the bank? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this excellent panel, and I'm really delighted and honored to be here. As you said, for us at the World Bank, this is new. We are a development institution whose mission is to fight poverty. We're used to investing in infrastructure, in education, in health. Investing in peace is new to us. But we cannot avoid it. Because as you rightly pointed out, more and more of the extreme poor people in the world are living in fragile and conflict countries. So today, the poverty rate in fragile and conflict countries has reached 55%. So if we really, in order to succeed in our mission of fighting poverty, we need to be involved in fragile and conflict situations, and we need to think about how can a development institution like the World Bank contribute to peace and stability. And let me suggest 4 ways that we can contribute to peace and stability, and 4 new directions for us. The first direction is really to focus on the drivers of fragility. We do analytical work, and we try to focus our interventions in those countries on the drivers of fragility to see how we can, what are the economic and social drivers of fragility in those situations. Poverty is not in and of itself a driver of fragility, actually. When we did analysis using Middle East, for example, of people joining extremist organizations, they're not necessarily the poorest people. They're often middle class, young people who feel injustice, who feel marginalized from society. So it is this feeling of injustice and marginalization. Therefore, inclusiveness becomes extremely important in our work. Second driver of fragility, which we see in many areas, is people living in lagging regions, in regions where the state is not fulfilling its role, where the state is not credible, and other forces come in and fill the vacuum left by the state. I'm thinking of areas like northern Sinai, like western and southern Tunisia, like northern Mali, northeast Nigeria. Those are regions where So another aspect of what we need to do is to look at how we can help develop the state services and build the credibility of the states in those lagging regions. Another example, we talked a lot today about climate change. We heard a lot about climate change. Climate change is one of the drivers of fragility in Africa, for sure. If you look at what is happening in the Sahel, for example, with climate change pushing herders more to the south and creating conflicts between herders and farmers. This is an economic conflict, but when the herders and farmers are from different ethnic groups and different religions, this economic conflict becomes explosive. So one of the types of projects, for example, that we're doing in the Sahel is to develop corridors for the herders to try to find new approaches of how to actually, this is really adaptation to climate change. Another aspect, for example, another problem, we talked about the role of women. Another driver of fragility is simply very high population growth rates that are putting tremendous pressure on very fragile economic and natural situations. The Sahel is a good example where we have very high fertility rates. And why is this happening? It's a problem. We believe that the issue here is to how to empower women in those societies. If a girl is not getting educated, she's getting married at the age of 12, and she is starting to have children at the age of 13. It becomes a really important social problem, not just from the demographic sense, but also from the human capital sense, because those children we have 40% stunting rates in Africa. We have very high maternal mortality rates, very high child mortality rates. So another type of project that we're doing is we have a project in the Sahel called the Sahel Women Empowerment and Demographic Dividend Project, SWED for short, that is really focusing on seeing how we can keep girls at school, how we can provide job opportunities for women, how we can increase access to reproductive health services. So this is the first point I wanted to make, and I'll go quickly on the remaining 3 points. The second point I would like to make, that we are doing differently from before, is that we actually are intervening and working during conflict situations. In the past, development agencies like ourselves would wait until the end of the conflict, and then we go and start working on reconstruction. Today, because of the protracted nature of the conflicts and because of the link between development and peace, we try to work during conflict. Achim mentioned the Iraq stabilization program, which is an excellent example of that. Another example that we're doing right now in central Mali is a development program in the area of Kona, for example, where the whole idea is to create bring about the necessary service for the people in this region, to create jobs and opportunities there to stabilize this region. And so that is another. The third area where we are active, and it is also dealing with the spillover effects of conflict. One of the most important spillover effects are refugees and how refugees are impacting host countries. Lebanon is a good example where we put in place this concessional financing facility to support the refugees and the host communities. In those cases, you need to support also the host communities. We have a big program also covering 100,000 refugees in Ethiopia. And this is another area. Finally, the last point, the fourth point that is important is that we cannot just think of fragility and conflict within a certain national borders within a country. Now, many of those conflicts that we see, especially in Africa, are regional and sub-regional. So we'll talk about the Sahel. The conflict in the Sahel does not stop at the borders of Mali. It spills over to Burkina. It's even now starting to impact northern Côte d'Ivoire. We talk about the Lake Chad region, North Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, Horn of Africa. So much of our work now is really in a regional context. Is how to work with the different countries in the region to develop approaches to deal with the drivers of fragility. And finally, obviously, for an institution like the World Bank that has no experience in political issues, in security issues, we're only a development institution. In order to be successful, we have to work very closely in partnership with others, especially the United Nations and with the bilateral agencies. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Doctor. It's exciting to hear about this new, if I may say, political role of the World Bank. And as Human Rights Ambassador of Sweden, of course, I'm happy to hear that now, in the bank's perspective, it is injustice and human rights violations rather than poverty that drive fragility. And as former ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Congo, I'm also happy that you focus on the vacuum left by state actors. Lastly, as a representative of a feminist foreign policy and a feminist government, I'm happy also to see the focus that you attach to women. So thank you very much, Dr. Hanem, for that. Let me now turn to Hirut Zemene, and I have to apologize. I said before I introduced you as State Secretary for Political Affairs, but you're obviously State Minister for Political Affairs at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Ethiopia. There's a great distinction there. I'm sorry. In Ethiopia, as we know, major reforms have been introduced for strengthened peace and democracy. And development. What are the main lessons learned from this process, would you say? And how are you, Ethiopia, finding the right balance between short-term crisis responses with long-term peace building? Please, Minister.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start out by saying, as previous speakers have said, it's an honor and privilege to be here to talk on a very important subject for the entire world, crisis response and sustainable peace. And don't worry about the title, because I came toiling through a third secretary, so I wouldn't mind my position that much. I usually look at what I contribute. And as you know, those of us coming from this trade are professionals that work on details and subjects, and we believe in teamwork. That's the most important thing. Just to directly go to the points that you wanted me to tackle on, Madam Moderator, I would want to start out with the mega trends that we see in the continent. And I think, if I may raise the two important ones. The first one is, the continent would be one of the fastest growing economies by 2025. Mm-hmm. And it will be also one of the regions that will have a high population growth. The African Union designated its last year's theme on how to harness the dividend of the youth, which is burgeoning in all of our countries, including my country. And I would want to come to my own region, that one of the fastest economies in the continent are found in Eastern Africa, which Ethiopia being one, has been growing for a double digit for a number of years, for a decade almost. But also we have this dividend that we want to call the use, having a very useful nation. It's both an opportunity and a challenge, because nowadays most of the youth that you find in Ethiopia are well educated, most of them having to do with some kind of degree, but we need to strive for employment. and that's not coming easy. The challenge that we face in youth development in Ethiopia now is we try to create a continuum and where the those that cannot be captured at the higher level of education could be engaged in technical and vocational training. But even for those, finding a job and creating job incubation is a challenge. The prospect is right because we are trying to move from an agrarian to an industrial nation. And we believe that as we industrialize, we'll create a lot of jobs for our population. But the serious challenge is that we'll have about 2 million demands for job every year. And that has to be made faster. So the demand for jobs and the way we are industrializing needs to be managed. So one of the areas why we need to take it as a crisis response issue, the previous speaker mentioned about migration, but also employment and managing the expectations of the youth, which is highly informed, is very, very important in managing crisis. Having said this, I would think that a very important continuum that we need to make in building sustainable peace is that when we come out of a crisis, we need to manage it very well. And I believe the experience of my country in March, when the government has been changed, through the resignation of my prime minister. I remember it was in March, on March 15, where I was leading a South Sudanese peace process in the ECA hall. And I want to share with you our experience, of course, with colleague members from the IGAD. Everyone was talking about, oh, in Ethiopia there's a change of administration, and we are talking about peace process here. So I remember we had a session in the afternoon, immediately after we heard this news at lunchtime, and the mediators that was working with me came to me and said, what's going to happen here? And I told them this is a resignation of the prime minister. He chose to hand over his power for the next person that would take the process further, because we are in a stage of reform. So all of a sudden the news spread, and the South Sudanese party started to say that, look at Ethiopia. The prime minister has willingly resigned. So this gives us a lesson. We need to do something about our negotiation. I believe it was a very important lesson that day. The meeting ended very well. And I think that was a precursor of the achievement of the IGAD, with many skeptics that South Sudanese peace process would not happen. But it happened. So the lessons learned in our let me come to our case, mini crisis that led to the resignation of a prime minister, and where a parliamentary democracy where a new leadership came out through the same ruling party has been defined in this way. In that crisis situation, there were a number of important steps taken. The first one was inclusivity. I think someone has said it already. Inclusiveness was very, very important. It was, like I would say, in 4 decades that in Ethiopian politics, modern day politics, that regardless of any views, all opposition parties were allowed to be part of the process. Many of them that have stayed between, on average, to 25 to 30 years abroad have all came back. And all of our prisons were emptied. And that included, the release of journalists, a number of them. And I would say that head-on, the Prime Minister had a fantastic address to the Parliament, where he enumerated his visions on how to lead the transition. I think that has set the tone, and that has, created a very good momentum to where we are 1 year after that incident. So to conclude, I would say that in crisis response, setting up the stage is very important. And it would be remiss of me if I don't mention in this reform that the Prime Minister has taken a very drastic stage in giving a role for women in terms of not only simply trying to show that half of the cabinet is composed of women, but by providing the commanding heights of the politics or the economics to women. And that started out by not only a cabinet position, but a very important step into peace building. The election board of Ethiopia was given to be chaired by a former opposition, which is a woman. And the defense ministry was given to a woman, an engineer woman. And trade was given for a woman. You name it. The two speakers of our two houses of the parliament were women. And I think that culminated with picking a president from the female gender. And that was very essential. It's not just because a woman was a president, but I think some of you know my president is a very outstanding diplomat, has served her country for 3 decades, and was within the region, serving in some of the conflict zones in our continent. And finally, she was the head of the United Nations Africa office in Nairobi, and also was moved to Ethiopia to lead the Horn of Africa office for, the AU office for the UN. So she was in a very thriving career, coming from a civil service and working in the United Nations system. So that meant a lot. It showed confidence, I believe, in our leadership, that women can be given prominent role, not just a balancing act, but an actual role. So I would say that for peace building, if the crisis stage is managed very well, it will give a very good ground. So I would say the upcoming election, the economic transformation that is tackled as one of the challenges where transformation is coming, was inclusive because many people from various walks of life were given the chance to come together and debate on how the economy should go. The report is complete, so that will be part of our transformation. And again, it would be remiss of me if I don't mention that very restrictive laws were managed in the justice reform, where the two prominent ones I want to mention is that the anti-terror law and the civil societies law was transformed and, reformed. I think I'll stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. It's easy to imagine that it must be tremendously exciting to be a member of the Ethiopian government at this stage. I see that State Secretary Valentin is nodding. She has served in Ethiopia, so she knows your context very well. You yourself said that developments have been drastic, and there is now and has had a catalytic effect, not only in country but also in the region. So a theater for, let's say, a political game change, one can say. Thank you for now. Now it's time for the perspective of General Dennis Gyllensporre, Force Commander of the MINUSMA peacekeeping operation in Mali. We could hear you this morning on Swedish Public Radio talking about your challenges, but also opportunities and impact of this peacekeeping operation, perhaps in the most complex and difficult and dangerous context that there exists today. As Force Commander of a UN peacekeeping mission, do you think that you have the tools necessary to contribute to sustainable peace? Are you, in your perspective, working as a one UN in Mali? And how would you like cooperation with humanitarian development and peace-building actors look like, given the respective mandates? Please, General.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this distinguished panel. And I'd also thank you for inviting somebody from the hard security side to this conference. I think it testifies of the inclusiveness that the Minister spoke about at the beginning. In an attempt to try to unpack your question with regards to the tools that I need, I think first of all I would like to emphasize that we are but one tool, the military, and of course I would like to have more resources to my disposal because of the challenges that we face in Mali in helping the Malian people to have a better livelihood. My focus, though, is to do as much as I can with the resource that I have. I put my emphasis on efficiency and being a key player for the common good. When it comes to contributing, I think that's one of the key words that you mentioned. Contributing to me is, of course, to be one of those actors that make a difference, but as important is to enable the Malian authorities, the Malian security forces, also to stand up their capacity to deal with the security challenges that the nation faces. So that is an important element of our efforts. The other point to address in your initial question is peace itself. And in Mali, we have a peace accord, and with 3 parties that have signed up for the peace accord, the implementation is moving forward, and we have a ceasefire between the signatory parties. So that in itself is an achievement that is sometimes forgotten. But underpinning the security environment is also reoccurring violence that is initiated by other armed groups that are not signatories of the peace accord. So it's basically one effort to continue the effort to implement the peace accord, and the other one is to deal with the security challenges on the ground, where other spoilers provides the challenges. So from a UN perspective, if you act as one entity, I think we have made significant improvements within the UN family. We have what is called an integrated strategic framework. So all the actors within the UN family comes together under the same aspirations and the same coordinated objectives. That's a strength that we have, and also the point of departure when we try to address different areas and different conflict regions. On that subject, the coordination and the efforts to interact with the other instruments, in my view, I think the key point is to have accept that there are differences between how we do our businesses and embrace mutual respect. We come with different traditions that make sense from our different areas of expertise. There should be no effort to try to harmonize the way we plan or how we conduct business, but rather to understand the other components, the other institutions, so that we can unite amongst common goals. And one of the ways to do that is to put emphasis on conflict analysis as in the early phases. Conflict analysis as a means to provide our different experiences and knowledge from our different ways of understanding conflict. And I think we all have different blind spots, regardless of what lens you use. But to bring that to the table, to share and build a collective body of knowledge, then that will allow us to draw our respective conclusions from it. So I will benefit in my decision making by getting the access to the information that other has, the knowledge. But it will be, at the end of the day, my conclusions, as it will be for other actors. But that will give us a sense of a common understanding of the conflict dynamics. And the next step is to plan ahead, to make sure that we have a good sense of where we're going and how we're doing it. And that this will, I think, set conditions for instance, creating the humanitarian space that is important from some actors, but also allow me as a force commander to plan operations in a deliberate manner in support of the higher objectives. When we conduct efforts, operations from our part, a critical element of making sure that we have coordination is to make sure that the situation awareness on a day-to-day basis is maintained through liaison officers to having people attached to the various organizations so we can follow the development and making sure that the critical coordination that needs to take place to address an issue can do so in a time-sensitive way. I'm satisfied to say that we have practiced this in Mali, in the central region, as we heard about earlier by the World Bank, where we come together and achieved quite a lot with some of these basic principles being applied.
Thank you very much, General. So it seems that the institutional setup is there to work together as one UN in Mali, but that your recipe is to draw upon each other's competences and with shared respect, mutual respect, rather than to blend or to compete even. Thank you for now, General. Now finally we have the last panelist, State Secretary Karin Wallensten, State Secretary for International Affairs at the Prime Minister's Office. You represent the Swedish government, and Sweden is a major humanitarian donor and a strong supporter to the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. I'd like to ask you, according to you, what are the opportunities and the limitations for humanitarian actors to collaborate today with development and peace-building actors? And while hearing you, I would also like to hear to ask you to add another perspective, a second area to address that I know is at the heart of the Prime Minister's Office, where there is a particular focus on SDG 10 about inequality. How can efforts to promote more equal societies constitute part of conflict prevention? So let's say two questions in one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annika, and also thank you very much to all of my fellow panelists.
I'm sorry we don't hear the State Secretary so well.
We'll try it this way. Is this better?
Oh, great.
Sorry about that. And thank you to the panelists. I really think the different testimonies that we have heard really show how important and timely these discussions are, and why the agenda of this forum is so challenging, but also so important and so urgent. Let me start by emphasizing the importance or the commitment that Sweden has to development cooperation. We allocate about 1% of GDP to development cooperation, to support the fight against poverty and to promote sustainable development. This is a very strong priority for my party, the Social Democrats, but I'm also very happy to say that this has a strong backing in the parliament to have this goal of 1%. And listening to these panelists, it's very easy to understand, to argue why we should do this and to believe that this is the right thing to do. Another conclusion that I draw from listening, and which Sweden also draws when we work with development cooperation, is strengthening the triple nexus. So the nexus between humanitarian aid, development cooperation, and peace work. And I understand that this must be done in respect of the humanitarian principles, and of course by the ODA criteria. But to answer your question about limitations and opportunities, I think some of the limitations were really addressed by our first speaker, Yann Eliasson, mentioned the risks if we work in silos. Dr. Samar addressed that we need all the aspects of rule of law and the human rights, women's issues, etc. And I think Peter Maurer was also addressing that we need to localize actions. If we don't do this, I think there will be strong limitations. Turning to the opportunities, I see the focus on collective outcomes as an opportunity. If we keep that focus, we can effectively reduce people's humanitarian needs and the risks and vulnerabilities. And we can strengthen prevention efforts and shift from delivering aid to ending need. But this will require from us to strengthen coherence. But I believe that if we have this nexus of humanitarian efforts, development efforts, and peace efforts, we can give the relief and in the same time keep our focus on the SDGs, which has been mentioned time and again here this morning. And in that regard, we can look at both reducing the humanitarian caseload and at the same time try to ensure our collective commitment of leaving no one behind, which is really the SDGs. To your second question on the SDG, yes, the SDG 10 is very important to the Prime Minister. I would like to think that all of the SDGs are, but as you asked me specifically for that one, my Prime Minister, as a former trade union man, he has a strong focus on equality, but also on SDG 8, on decent work and economic growth, and I would like to return to that one as well. But looking at the SDG on reducing inequalities, something that concerns him very much is that with growing inequalities within societies, there's the risk of marginalization, there's the risk of people who are feeling left out are more likely to turn to xenophobia and to extremism of different kinds. We see this in urban areas, we see the risk of internal unrest, we see criminality and the intracommunal violence. So this inequality is, we believe, is a threat to domestic security, and it can breed nationalism in a way that is also creating a less secure international situation. So inequality is therefore, this is the government's conclusion, fighting social exclusion and increasing equality is necessary to develop our societies, but also to increase our common security. And so promoting efforts to build more equal societies is also a way to building long-term peace. Can I just also say a couple of words on the SDG 10 as being part of the peace agenda, or sorry, about the SDG 10, the decent work. One thing that my Prime Minister puts a lot of emphasis on is on the social dialogue, the dialogue between partners in the labor market, between trade unions and between employers and between governments. If there's more of a feeling of being included also in different kinds of discussions that also in post-conflict situations, the social dialogue has been a powerful tool to transit to democracy. And I think the best example we have of that is in Tunisia, where the quartet who was part of the peace process even received the Nobel Prize. And there are similar examples from Colombia, where particularly at local level, Sweden has worked together with the UNDP to bring in social dialogue into development and reconciliation projects. Another example is the Global Deal, to which I know the Ethiopia has also joined, which is really about promoting social dialogue in countries. So I think including the SDG 8 and the SDG 10 is really about the greater good of peace, predictability, and the prosperity of societies.
Thank you very much, Karin, for the Swedish perspective, both when it comes to what we call the triple nexus, but also on the SDGs. Time is running fast, and we are approaching the coffee break. But before we break up, I would like to give the floor to our audience. But before that, also an opportunity for our panelists to express themselves very, very, very briefly to a general question. And in a first quick round, I would just like to have a yes or no from you. And in a second round, you will be able to expand a little bit. The question is the international community geared for comprehensive response to crisis and build long-term peace and development? Please ask yes or no. Achim Steiner, what is your answer? And in the second round, you will be able to give an example if yes, or give an example if your answer is no.
I have no choice but to say yes.
Wonderful. I love your optimism. Karin.
Perhaps my answer would be on its way to yes.
Great.
No, that's cheating.
General?
My answer would be yes.
Minister?
Wow. It would be no, but I think they know now what lessons they could derive from previous experiences and how to tackle it. So I think they're on their way to yes.
All right. Minister?
I didn't get the question, I'm sorry.
The question was if the international community today is geared for a comprehensive response to crisis and to build long-term peace and development.
I wouldn't answer in a yes or no form because it would have yes, but, if, but, so.
You'll be able to expand in a moment. Doctor?
Yes.
Yes, all right, very well. So maybe, Minister, you said no, I believe, or you were hoping. What would be required then?
Listen, obviously we're forever grateful. All of our countries, recipient countries, are forever grateful for all the assistance that is being provided to our countries. However, I believe there are some measures that could be taken by the international donor community in order to maximize the full benefit of aid towards sustainable peace and building resilient capacities within local governments. This is something that should be worked on. From our end, of course, we need to work on at least building consensus on an overarching framework for sustainable development. We're trying to do that in Lebanon because that would hopefully help to channel funds under a locally owned sustainable development framework. But the donor community, I think, from our perspective as Lebanese who have suffered through so much, and maybe you can derive the most lessons from the Lebanese experience with the Syrian refugee crisis. So even though we've received a lot of aid and support, however, there are some things that could be done better in order to reduce any suspicion that the Lebanese have towards the perceived agenda of the donor community, perceived political agenda of the donor community. So, for example, do as much humanitarian or do as much developmental as humanitarian. Don't embed suspicious-looking conditionalities to certain assistance. Try to work together, build the capacities. So there are some things that could be done maybe better. I think a lot could be derived from previous experiences, and I think hopefully things will become better for, for our countries and unfortunately more conflict-prone countries.
Thank you, Madam Minister.
Sure.
Mr. Steiner, you were an optimist?
Not an optimist. I think, frankly speaking, we do succeed at times, and it shows that we're capable of doing it. So my answer is an yes under the conditions that you asked me. Do we fail regularly? Do we succeed? Yes. The problem is we often dwell on the failures as failures rather than on the successes to learn the lessons of what it is that actually makes it happen. So my example would be in 2016. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Somalia is here, and we spoke about it last night together. We came together as a humanitarian development international community with the countries concerned and averted what was a drought that could have turned into a famine with disastrous consequences. All this was mobilized in less than 6 months with massive international support, massive local mobilization, and in the case of Somalia, investing humanitarian resources in also creating greater resilience in the case of future droughts. That is an example. The world never spoke about it because it didn't become a famine. This is also the tragedy that we face when we talk to our public. They do not know how many times a day the United Nations, the humanitarians, the NGOs are saving millions of lives. Just as we sit here today, our colleagues in the World Food Programme, embedded in the humanitarian response, supported often in mission settings such as MINUSMA, but also collaborating with the development program of the United Nations, are keeping 92 million people supplied with food every day. 92 million people. That's a remarkable number. So my answer is unreservedly yes, but not in denial of what you, Minister, and others know very well, that we fail ourselves and the countries miserably, but it is a collective failure, and I respect very much what you say, but it is a collective failure for which we must also answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President?
Yeah, I said yes, and because, which does not mean that we sometimes fail. We sometimes fail, obviously, but we are geared to work together to achieve results. And I can give you an example. I mean, I was recently in the Central African Republic, and you see there how the United Nations organizations, how the humanitarians, and how we, the development area, are working very closely together, including actually working with the security forces in the Central African Republic. We have this project called Londo in the Bambari region, where we are working very closely with MINUSCA. And this project is actually creating jobs and opportunities so that people who formerly were in militias and so on now have something different to do. I was there visiting this project, and I was really impressed by how the entire international community is working together to support the Central African Republic and the government of the Central African Republic and the different factions who signed the peace accord to maintain that peace. But of course, we in the international community cannot succeed on our own. The country itself and the people themselves have to play the leading role. And we can only support the local efforts for building peace. We cannot impose peace on countries.
Thank you for that example. Madam Minister, would you agree that the international community is geared and knows what to do, but that sometimes we fail nevertheless?
Thank you very much. I think I want to put it from the perspective of ownership. The whole thing boils down to that, because the reality on the ground depends from nations to nations. And I would want to agree to the intervention that came from the multilaterals in a way that if countries own their destiny, I know crises vary. Sometimes countries might not even be able to own the situation, but wherever there is a nation that owns the situation and tries to manage and sees where the gap is, I think usually the coordination is, even if it's not coordinated, even if it comes from different directions, the nation will manage to put its house in order because it knows where to chip in, where to take what it has chipped in. But if there is no ownership locally, the challenges definitely will be protracted. But my worry would not be on the coordination of the international system that has been trying to be formed for some time now, since the idea of one UN and the like. And usually donors try to coordinate within a nation. But the challenge is the dwindling of resources, I believe, currently. There are lots of issues that need attention, and resources are not there anymore. I would want to mention here, for example, the situation of some of the African-led peace operations. where they are in lack of financing. And if that would happen, we would move a further step ahead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. Force Commander?
Well, without hesitation, I said yes, and I'm proud to represent one of the premier institutions that has dedicated itself to a broad approach on conflict and peace and development. And the UN not just deciding decisions coming from the Security Council, but more important from the General Assembly, I think speaks volumes about the commitment that the institution has. My force that I command has soldiers from 55 countries from all over the world. And that in itself speaks volumes about the commitment from various nations that are part of the United Nations. The challenge is, of course, to find the solutions on the ground, to adapt, to be pragmatic, and to understand the conflict that we have to address. But that's not to confuse with the commitment and the aspirations that the UN and others has.
Thank you. Madam State Secretary, would you like to also?
Yeah, maybe it's just the nature of a politician to never really be content with things, to always want to improve. And I do agree with that. There's a lot that we should be, the positive aspects that we should be looking more at. But I think we also have heard from this morning that there's always more room for improvement.
Thank
Annika,
you.
May I just say one thing? Because
yes.
My esteemed colleague Hirut is here. The drought example is another excellent moment in 2016 because Ethiopia, in many respects, was a key partner in actually making the international effort succeed because of the many lessons that have been learned in Ethiopia, that have been translated into new policies and risk response and rapid response mechanisms. And I just want to make this point because we don't give credit also to the countries that in a moment of crisis are viewed simply as failures, when in fact they often have learned extraordinary lessons, changed their approaches, and the success of not having a famine in 2016 in Ethiopia was, I would say, in large part a consequence of Ethiopia's lessons learned, where the international community could fit into. And that's also an important aspect we should mention, I think, because it is part of this learning the lesson of the forum that we're having. Thank you.
Thank you for that remark. We now have the opportunity for maybe one or two very brief questions from the audience, from our very august panel. Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm Baranga. I'm a Deputy Special Representative of Secretary General in MINUSMA, and we work together with the General. Thank you so much. I may just say one comment and one question. Comment is the pathway on peace, which World Bank, UNDP, and everybody work together is a fantastic tool because it shows how this nexus is possible. However, my question, because we work very closely with the General, delivering on the ground when you work in asymmetric threats, how you deliver effectively and you put together development, humanitarian peace building, human rights, and humanitarian principle. I don't know if Mr. Maurer is still here, but I will really maybe challenge all of us to think in the past 10 years that we have been challenged with asymmetric threats. We don't have a solution on the ground. Because these guys are very clever. The terrorists are clever. They have money. They have a struggling. In Sahel, we see it. They are coming to community, giving $300, 300 euro to the young guy or young girl of 10 years, 12 years, to put ID on the ground. So are we really ready to challenge those guys and also to know that the impunity is still there too? We are failing to bring these guys to justice. Therefore, are we willing to really save Sahel this time? Because today is Mali, tomorrow is Burkina, Niger, and everywhere. So are we really in this panel capable to respond to this question? Impunity towards these guys who we know are there. Yes, the military are there. Yes, Barkhane is there, but we are failing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think I saw Magnus Valand, yes, right, from Diakonia, leading civil society organization in Sweden.
Thank you
Please,
very
Magnus.
much. As civil society organizations, we are sometimes ignored, sometimes right holders organizations are seen as often a tool. We can see trends of that and examples of that. So my basic question, how do we avoid that civil society and grassroots organization becomes tools of others' agendas, political and even military sometimes?
Thank you very much. Who would like to respond to these two questions? Any volunteer?
I mean,
Please, Minister.
Maybe I can answer the Diakonia, that's how you pronounce it.
Very well.
Representative. Actually, I'm considering giving you the office in Lebanon, permission to operate. So
you should.
Yeah, I should, obviously. Now I've met one representative.
Yeah.
Listen, civil society is part and parcel of any dialogue that ensures that sustainable peace happens. I mean, from our end, if civil society and the perspective they bring to the table are not involved, then we would not be able to put any kind of reform or any kind of peace-building initiative or any kind of conflict prevention initiative to be sustainable and to be implementable. I just wanted to use that to say, for example, for some countries who have not been able to reach a consensus on a reform of some sort, because it's sometimes difficult in a conflict-ridden country to reach a consensus, especially when you have warring parties. How do you come up with a framework, a developmental framework that ensures that donors buy into that framework, channel their funds into that framework, and make sure that this is sustainable? So the way we did it, I don't know whether it works, is that we came up with a framework for assistance called Prevention of Violent Extremism Framework. And the civil society organizations in Lebanon were heavily involved, plus the educational institutions, plus the 29 ministries. Hopefully this will bring all the different stakeholders together to sign off on a framework that hopefully will get buy-in more than another framework that is more difficult to get buy-in. So this is one way of us trying to approach the situation, and of course NGOs are part and parcel of that work we're doing.
Thank you. Yes,
yes,
please, Dr. Khanen.
I'll try to respond to the very difficult question of Mali. None of us as organizations have the answers for everything. Like, there are different, the general works on the security side. The United Nations has more of a political mandate, and we work on the development side, others work on the humanitarian side. What is very important when we deliver support as one group is to coordinate amongst ourselves, but also we need to avoid replacing the government. A big problem in many of the areas in countries in fragile situations is the lack of the credibility of the government, the lack of credibility of the state. And it would be dangerous for foreign actors to try to replace. We need to come in support of government action, in support of the Malian state in this specific case. And that is how we should be delivering. We try at the bank, we try always to avoid except in very extreme situations, like when we were working in Yemen, for example. But in Mali, our approach is to try to provide the services, to provide the support through the Malian government, because it is important to establish and to strengthen the capacity, the local capacity for peace and security.
Thank you very much. Before we break for coffee, I would like to give the floor yet again to the Minister for Development Cooperation for a brief comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for an extremely interesting discussion around one of our world's most important questions. I think you can say that we have a lot of good things happening. My friend from Somalia, is the foreign minister, is one of these things, going around and telling that a long conflict can change. Ethiopia is also a very positive thing happening right now. But of course, we have a lot of challenges. We know the climate question is not we do not meet as we should, and biodiversity and land degradation is also extremely important, and we are not doing what we could and should in these matters. But I have to say one more thing that maybe we haven't talked about so much so far, is that when we look around at the world, some countries are doing better and more democratic advancements, but if we look at the whole world right now, all scientists tell us that the majority of people on the globe now lives in countries where democracy is going downwards. The tendency is not good. And I have always felt that democracy is the alternative to war, to conflicts, to use weapons, to taking up war. And I fear that it could be that what we see right now in the latest years could be warning signals, early warnings for a world more in conflict. And therefore, I would call to you and to the UN, and we try to do this in Sweden. We take the democratic offensive today as one of our most important tasks to work to change this very bad tendency for a less democratic world, because we fear that this also could be a way for more conflicts and more wars. So that is also a matter that we should take up when we are talking about preventing peace and development, I see. And I hope that these discussions will go on and be very fruitful in these coming 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And thank you for that reference to the Swedish government's drive for democracy that has been launched. With that, we will break for coffee. We will gather again at 11:15 in 5 parallel sessions. But before so, I wish to extend a warm thank you to our distinguished panelists for your very important contributions. Thank you.